Have you ever had that gut-wrenching moment when you realize the people you trusted most in this world were actively working to destroy you? I mean, really destroy you. Not just hurt your feelings or say something mean behind your back, but systematically dismantling everything you'd built over years of hard work, planning your financial ruin with the precision of architects designing a building, except this building was meant to collapse with me inside it? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. And I'm still shaking as I tell you this story, because what I discovered was so calculated, so deliberate, so absolutely devastating, that even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in cold sweats wondering what would have happened if I hadn't asked that one simple question. That single question, which seemed so innocent at the time, so casual that I almost didn't ask it at all, ended up being the thread that, when I pulled it, unraveled an entire tapestry of deception that had been woven around me for months. My name isn't important, but my story is. Because if this could happen to me, someone who considered themselves reasonably intelligent, aware, and careful, it could happen to anyone. And that terrifies me. It should terrify you too. Because the people who were destroying me weren't strangers, weren't some faceless criminals I'd never met. They were people I'd shared meals with, celebrated holidays with, trusted with my deepest secrets and my financial information. They were people who knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage, and they were doing it with smiles on their faces, with hugs and well wishes, all while stabbing me in the back so deeply that I should have bled out completely. But I didn't. I survived. And this is how I discovered their plan before it was too late. Though by the time I found out, they'd already done significant damage that I'm still recovering from today. This isn't just a story about betrayal, though there's plenty of that. This isn't just about money, though massive amounts of money were involved. This is about how easy it is for evil to hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of love and concern, and how one moment of clarity, one instant of divine intervention or pure luck or whatever you want to call it, can save your entire life from destruction. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a time when my life looked absolutely perfect from the outside, because that's where every good nightmare starts, isn't it? In a dream. I was living what most people would consider the American dream, or at least a very comfortable version of it. I had worked my way up in my career over 15 years, starting from an entry-level position right out of college and climbing the ladder through sheer determination, long hours, and genuine skill in my field. I won't go into the specifics of what I do because that's not really relevant, but let's just say I'd become successful enough that money wasn't something I worried about on a daily basis anymore. I had a beautiful home in a good neighborhood, the kind of place with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors who actually knew each other's names. I drove a nice car, not ostentatious or flashy, but reliable and comfortable. I'd built up substantial savings, invested wisely with the help of financial advisors I'd carefully vetted, and I was on track for an early retirement if I wanted it. More importantly than all of that material success, I had relationships that I valued deeply. I had family members I was close to, people I'd grown up with and maintained connections with through all of life's ups and downs. I had friends I'd known for decades, people who'd been there through my struggles and my triumphs. And I had business partners and colleagues who I trusted implicitly, people I'd worked alongside for years, building something together. My life wasn't perfect, no one's is, but it was good, solid, stable. I felt secure in a way that I realize now was dangerously naive. I thought I'd done everything right. I thought I'd been smart about protecting myself and my assets. I thought the people around me genuinely cared about my well-being. I thought wrong. So devastatingly, catastrophically wrong that if you'd told me then what I know now, I would have laughed in your face and called you paranoid. That's what makes this whole thing so insidious, so deeply violating. They waited until I was at my most secure, my most comfortable, my most trusting, and that's when they struck. Or rather, that's when they began laying the groundwork for my destruction, because what I eventually discovered was that this wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was premeditated, planned over months, maybe even longer, with multiple people involved and coordinated in their efforts. They studied me like scientists study lab rats, learning my patterns, my weaknesses, my blind spots, and then they exploited every single one of them with ruthless efficiency. The betrayal wasn't just about the money they stole or tried to steal. It was about the violation of trust, the shattering of my belief that the people closest to me had my best interests at heart, the devastating realization that I had been nothing more than a target to them, a means to an end, a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be loved. The weird thing about betrayal is that your body often knows before your mind does. I started feeling off months before I consciously recognized that anything was wrong. You know that feeling when something just doesn't sit right in your gut, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? That was me for weeks, maybe months. I'd be sitting in meetings or family gatherings, and I'd get this prickly sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched or evaluated in some way that wasn't entirely friendly. I'd catch people exchanging glances that seemed to carry meaning I wasn't privy to, looks that lasted just a fraction of a second too long to be completely innocent. Conversations would pause when I entered rooms, not in an obvious, suspicious way, but in that subtle shift that happens when people have been talking about you and now have to pretend they weren't. At first, I dismissed these feelings entirely. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was stressed from work, that I was imagining things because I'd been watching too many thriller movies or reading too many conspiracy theories online. I actually felt guilty for having these suspicious thoughts about people I loved and trusted. Can you imagine that? I was apologizing to myself for my own instincts trying to warn me of danger. That's how well trained we are to ignore our gut feelings in favor of social niceties and trusting relationships. But the signs kept coming, small at first, barely noticeable, like the first few drops of rain before a hurricane. Financial documents would be in slightly different positions than where I'd left them. My mail seemed to arrive already opened sometimes, though it was never anything obvious, just a subtle loosening of seals that I couldn't quite prove. People started asking me questions about my finances that seemed casual enough on the surface, but in retrospect were clearly fishing for specific information. How much did I have in savings? What were my investment strategies? Who were my financial advisors? What passwords did I use for my accounts? That last one was always disguised as concern. They'd say things like, "You should really write down your passwords somewhere safe in case something happens to you." Or, "Have you thought about what would happen to your accounts if you were in an accident?" I thought they cared about my well-being. I thought they were being thoughtful and prudent. I had no idea they were assembling the keys to dismantle my entire financial life. The manipulation was so subtle, so expertly done, that I feel foolish even now for not seeing it sooner. But that's the thing about people who are close to you. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You interpret their actions in the most charitable light possible. You assume good intentions because to assume otherwise would mean acknowledging that your entire sense of reality might be wrong. The first major red flag that I couldn't ignore came about 6 months before everything exploded. I was reviewing my bank statements one evening, something I did religiously every month because despite my trust in people, I'd always been careful about my finances. That's when I noticed a small discrepancy. It was tiny, only about $200, and it was categorized as a transfer to one of my investment accounts. The thing is, I didn't remember making that transfer. Now, $200 isn't life-changing money for someone in my position, and normally I might have just assumed I'd forgotten about it and moved on. But something about it bothered me. The timing was odd. It had been made at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time when I was definitely asleep. The method was also strange. It had been done through a platform I rarely used, not my usual banking app. I made a note of it and decided to keep an eye on my accounts more closely. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more irregularities. They were never huge amounts, always small enough to potentially escape notice, but they were there. A transfer here, a withdrawal there, charges on credit cards I didn't remember making. Each one individually could be explained away. Maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe there was a delayed charge from something I'd purchased weeks ago. Maybe the bank had made an error. But taken together, they formed a pattern that made my blood run cold. Someone was accessing my accounts. Someone who knew enough to make it look legitimate, who understood my spending patterns well enough to hide fraudulent transactions among real ones. Someone who had access to my passwords, my security questions, my financial institutions. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. This wasn't random identity theft by some stranger on the internet. This was someone close to me, someone who had intimate knowledge of my financial life. Have you ever felt the ground shift beneath your feet? Not literally, but emotionally, when you realize that your reality is not what you thought it was? That's what I felt in that moment, sitting alone in my home office, staring at my computer screen with bank statements open in multiple windows, each one showing another tiny crack in the foundation of my financial security. The fear that washed over me wasn't just about the money, though that was certainly part of it. It was about the violation, the breach of trust, the understanding that someone I knew, someone I probably cared about, was actively working to harm me. I want to tell you that I immediately sprang into action, that I called the police or confronted everyone I knew or changed all my passwords right then and there. But I didn't. Fear paralyzed me. Not fear of physical danger, but fear of what I might find if I dug deeper. Because to investigate this properly, I'd have to suspect everyone in my inner circle. I'd have to question every relationship, doubt every kind gesture, re-examine every moment of trust I'd extended. That's exhausting and heartbreaking in ways that are hard to describe. So instead, I did what many people do when confronted with uncomfortable truths. I engaged in a bit of denial. I changed a few passwords, the really important ones, but I told myself I was probably overreacting. I told myself that there must be a reasonable explanation. I told myself that the people I loved wouldn't do this to me. But I also started documenting everything. I created a secure folder on my computer, encrypted it with a password I'd never used before, and I started keeping meticulous records of every financial transaction, every unusual occurrence, every weird conversation. I began taking screenshots of my account balances daily, noting the timestamps and dates. I started saving emails and text messages that seemed even remotely suspicious. I kept a journal of interactions with people, noting who asked what questions and how they reacted to my answers. I felt like I was going crazy, like I was becoming paranoid and obsessive. But looking back now, that documentation is what saved me. That evidence is what made the difference between having suspicions and having proof. It's what allowed me to eventually expose everything and protect what was left of my finances. But in those early weeks of investigation, I just felt isolated and scared, living in my beautiful home that suddenly felt like a house of cards that could collapse at any moment, going through the motions of my daily life while internally I was falling apart, smiling at people while wondering if they were the ones systematically destroying me. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How do you sit at a dinner table with family members, making small talk about weather and work and current events, when in the back of your mind you're wondering if the person passing you the salad is the same person who's stealing your identity and draining your accounts? As I dug deeper, the scope of what was happening became clearer and far more terrifying than I'd initially imagined. This wasn't just someone skimming a little money here and there. This was a comprehensive, multifaceted attack on every aspect of my financial life. I discovered that someone had been filing false claims with my insurance companies, trying to cash in on policies I didn't even know I had. There were credit cards opened in my name that I'd never applied for, with charges accumulating on them that I knew nothing about. My credit score, which had always been excellent, had started dropping, and when I pulled my credit report, I found inquiries from financial institutions I'd never contacted. Someone had attempted to take out loans using my information. There were even efforts to change the beneficiaries on some of my accounts and investment portfolios. Each discovery was like another punch to the gut, another layer of betrayal revealed. But here's what really got me. What made this go from a crime to something deeply personal and cruel? Whoever was doing this knew me well enough to anticipate my reactions and plan around them. They knew I checked my main bank account regularly, so they focused on secondary accounts I looked at less frequently. They knew I was trusting of certain people, so they used those relationships as cover for their activities. They knew my routines, my schedule, when I'd be distracted or out of town. This wasn't some random scammer who'd gotten hold of my social security number. This was someone, or more likely multiple someones, who had intimate access to my life and were using that access to destroy me financially. The emotional toll of this realization cannot be overstated. I started having panic attacks, something I'd never experienced before in my life. I'd be driving to work and suddenly my chest would tighten, my breathing would become shallow, and I'd have to pull over because I couldn't focus on the road. I stopped sleeping well, lying awake at night running through scenarios in my head, trying to figure out who could be behind this and why. Why would someone do this to me? What had I done to deserve such calculated cruelty? Was it jealousy of my success? Greed for my money? Some perceived slight I wasn't even aware of? The not knowing was almost worse than the theft itself. I felt like I was losing my mind, second-guessing every interaction, analyzing every conversation for hidden meanings, suspicious of everyone and everything. It's an incredibly isolating experience because you can't talk to the people you'd normally turn to for support, when those very people might be the ones causing your suffering. I decided I needed professional help, but I had to be strategic about who I asked for help from because I didn't know who was involved in the conspiracy against me. I couldn't go to family members because some of them might be the perpetrators. I couldn't go to my usual friends or business associates for the same reason. So I reached out to a lawyer I'd met at a conference years ago, someone I had no personal connection to beyond a professional acquaintance, someone who had no access to my life or finances, someone who had no motive to be part of whatever was happening to me. I explained the situation, showed him the documentation I'd been compiling, and asked for his advice. He looked at everything carefully, and then he told me something that chilled me to my core. He said, "This looks like elder fraud tactics, but adapted for someone younger. Usually, we see this kind of systematic financial abuse targeting elderly people whose families want to get at their money. But the same principles apply here. Someone close to you, probably multiple people, have decided you're worth more to them broke than you are successful. They're positioning themselves to swoop in and help you when you eventually hit bottom, which will give them even more control over your remaining assets. He explained that these kinds of schemes often involve turning the victim into someone who appears financially incompetent or mentally unstable, so that when the perpetrators eventually make their final moves, they can claim they're acting in the victim's best interests. They create a narrative where they're the heroes saving a person who can't manage their own affairs. It's diabolical, calculated, and unfortunately, it's more common than most people realize. My lawyer advised me to continue documenting everything, but to be even more careful about who I trusted. He suggested I hire a forensic accountant to trace the unauthorized transactions and identify patterns that might reveal who was behind them. He also recommended I set up new accounts at financial institutions where I had no existing relationships, accounts that no one in my life knew about, and start quietly moving some of my assets to those secure locations. It felt like I was preparing for war, and in a way, I was. I was about to go to battle against people I loved, people I'd trusted, people who had been smiling in my face while stabbing me in the back. Have you ever been through something where the people closest to you, the ones you trusted most, turned out to be completely different than who you thought they were? Have you ever had to question every relationship in your life simultaneously, not knowing who was friend and who was foe? It's a special kind of hell, and if you've experienced it, I want you to know you're not alone. Drop a comment below and share your story, because these experiences, as painful as they are, connect us and remind us that we can survive betrayal and come out stronger. The forensic accountant I hired was worth every penny. Within 2 weeks, she'd uncovered a trail that led back to several sources, and she'd identified patterns in the unauthorized access to my accounts that suggested at least 3 different people were involved, possibly more. She found IP addresses that matched locations where certain family members lived. She found transaction times that coincided with visits from specific friends. She discovered that some of the fraudulent credit cards had been sent to addresses associated with my business partners. The net was closing, and I was starting to see the full picture of who had betrayed me. But I still didn't know the complete extent of their plan, and I didn't know how they'd managed to coordinate their efforts so effectively. That's when I decided I needed to set a trap, to create a situation where the perpetrators would reveal themselves fully. I started casually mentioning to different people that I was planning to make some major financial moves, that I'd recently come into a large inheritance from a distant relative, that I was considering consolidating all my accounts at one institution for easier management. Each person I told got a slightly different version of the story, with unique details that would allow me to trace back who shared what information with whom. It's an old technique, sometimes called a canary trap, where you give different versions of sensitive information to different people so you can identify the leak when the information gets out. And boy, did the information get out. Within days, I started seeing suspicious activity related to the fake inheritance I'd mentioned. People were trying to access accounts I'd claimed the inheritance would be deposited into. I was getting calls from financial advisors I'd never heard of, offering to help me manage this new windfall. The trap was working, and I was getting closer to identifying everyone involved. But the most dramatic revelation was yet to come. The moment of truth came at what was supposed to be a casual family dinner at my home. I'd invited several relatives and close friends, people I'd shared this supposed inheritance news with, people I suspected were involved in the plot against me. I'd set up hidden cameras in my home office and dining room, legal in my state for security purposes, because I wanted proof of whatever was about to happen. Dinner was pleasant enough on the surface, everyone chatting and laughing, asking me about this inheritance I'd supposedly received. They were all very interested in the details. How much was it? Where was it coming from? When would I receive it? What did I plan to do with it? Their interest seemed genuine and caring on the surface, but I could see the greed in their eyes now that I knew what to look for. The way they leaned forward when I talked about money, the way their pupils dilated slightly, the micro-expressions of excitement they couldn't quite hide. After dinner, several people drifted into my home office, claiming they wanted to see some photos I'd mentioned earlier. This was part of my plan. I'd deliberately guided the conversation to create a reason for people to be in that room, where I kept most of my financial documents and my computer. I watched from the doorway as they looked around, ostensibly interested in my photo albums, but I could see their eyes darting to my desk, my filing cabinets, the places where someone might keep important papers. And then, in a moment that still gives me goosebumps when I think about it, I asked the simple question that would expose everything. One of my relatives, someone I'd known my entire life, someone I'd trusted implicitly, casually sat down at my computer and woke up the screen. Without logging in, without asking permission, they just moved the mouse and the screen came to life showing my desktop. And I asked, so casually, so innocently, how did you know my computer password? There was a moment of frozen silence, the kind of silence where you can almost hear the gears turning in someone's brain as they try to come up with a plausible lie. The color drained from their face. Their hands froze on the keyboard. Other people in the room suddenly became very interested in looking anywhere, but at me or at the person sitting at my computer. The air in the room became thick with tension, heavy with the weight of lies about to crumble. They stammered something about how I must have told them at some point, how they didn't really remember, how maybe the computer wasn't locked after all. But I knew, and they knew that I knew. My computer was always locked with a complex password I'd never shared with anyone. And in that moment, I saw the panic flash across not just their face, but the faces of several other people in the room, and everything clicked into place like the final pieces of a puzzle forming a picture I'd been trying to see for months. That single simple question, how did you know my computer password, was the thread that unraveled everything. Because once I'd asked it, once the panic had set in, people started making mistakes. The person at my computer became defensive, then angry, accusing me of being paranoid and suspicious, of setting them up, of being a terrible person for not trusting family. Others jumped in to defend them, but in doing so, they revealed knowledge they shouldn't have had about my accounts, my passwords, my financial situation. One person mentioned a bank account I'd never told them about. Another referenced an investment I'd only discussed in emails I thought were private. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion, each person's attempt to cover for themselves or others only exposing more of the conspiracy. I stayed calm, eerily calm considering the circumstances, and I simply said, I think we need to talk about what's really been going on. I pulled out my phone and showed them some of the documentation I'd compiled. Screenshots of unauthorized transactions, records of attempted fraud, evidence of credit cards opened in my name, the forensic accountants' report tracing activities back to their IP addresses. I watched the color drain from several faces. Some people tried to leave, but I told them that leaving now would only make things worse, that I already had lawyers involved, that I already had evidence being turned over to law enforcement, that this was their chance to come clean and potentially minimize the consequences they were facing. And then the confessions started tumbling out, not all at once, but over the next several hours as some people tried to minimize their involvement while blaming others, as alliances that had been formed to destroy me crumbled under the pressure of being exposed. It was one of the most surreal nights of my life, sitting in my living room that had hosted so many happy gatherings, now the scene of a devastating unraveling of relationships and trust. People I loved, people I'd trusted, people who I thought loved me, admitting they'd been stealing from me, justifying their actions with grievances I didn't even know they had. One person said they felt I'd always been the favorite in the family and didn't deserve all my success. Another claimed I owed them money from decades ago, a debt I had no memory of, and that they'd never mentioned until that moment when they needed an excuse for their behavior. A third said they'd just been following along with others' plans and hadn't realized how serious it was, as if that absolved them of responsibility for participating in my financial destruction. The rationalizations were as varied as they were pathetic, and not one of them took full responsibility. Not one of them seemed to grasp the enormity of what they'd done, how completely they'd violated my trust and tried to ruin my life. They'd spent months, possibly longer, planning my financial destruction, coordinating their efforts through secret communications, sharing my passwords and personal information among themselves, filing false claims in my name, opening fraudulent accounts, all while sitting at my dinner table and accepting my hospitality and pretending to care about me. The betrayal was so complete, so total, that I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, except this nightmare was real, and the monsters were people I'd known and loved for years. The aftermath of that night was a whirlwind of legal action, police reports, and long, painful conversations with lawyers and law enforcement. I pressed charges against everyone involved, despite pressure from other family members who weren't part of the scheme to keep it in the family and handle it privately. They said I was tearing the family apart, that I was being vindictive, that I should forgive and forget, because that's what family does. But I refused. What they'd done wasn't just morally wrong, it was illegal, and they needed to face real consequences. I wasn't tearing the family apart. They had done that when they decided to victimize me. I was simply refusing to enable their criminal behavior by protecting them from justice. The forensic accountant's final report showed that over the course of 6 months, they'd stolen or attempted to steal nearly $250,000 from me through various schemes. Some of it I could recover through insurance and legal action, but much of it was gone forever. The damage to my credit would take years to fully repair. The emotional damage was incalculable and would take even longer to heal, if it ever fully healed at all. Some of the people involved faced criminal charges and were eventually convicted. Others agreed to restitution deals to avoid jail time, though I doubted I'd ever see most of that money. Some relationships in my family were permanently destroyed, with people taking sides, with those who weren't involved in the theft having to choose between maintaining relationships with me or with the perpetrators. I lost people I'd known my entire life. I had to accept that those relationships had been illusions, that the people I thought I knew had never really existed, at least not in the form I'd believed them to be. The rebuilding process was long and painful in ways I'm still dealing with today. I had to change all my passwords, close accounts, open new ones at different institutions, file disputes with credit bureaus, work with identity theft protection services, install comprehensive security systems in my home, and basically lock down every aspect of my financial life. I started therapy to deal with the trauma and betrayal, to work through the paranoia and trust issues that naturally developed after being victimized by people so close to me. I had to learn how to trust again, how to open up to new relationships while maintaining healthy boundaries, how to not let what happened to me turn me into a bitter, suspicious person who sees enemies everywhere. It's been a journey, one I'm still on, and probably will be for the rest of my life in some ways. But here's what I want you to understand, what I need you to take away from my story. I survived. I'm still here. I protected enough of my assets that I'm still financially stable, though not as comfortable as I was before all this happened. I rebuilt my credit slowly and methodically. I found new people to trust, slowly and carefully, testing those relationships over time before allowing them to get too close to my financial life or my heart. I learned valuable lessons about vigilance, about listening to my instincts even when they make me uncomfortable, about the importance of documentation and verification, even with people you love and trust. Looking back now, I can see warning signs I missed, red flags I dismissed because I wanted to believe the best in people. I can see how my desire to be trusting and open, qualities that are generally positive and that I still value, made me vulnerable to exploitation by people who had no qualms about taking advantage of my good nature. And while I wish I could go back and protect my younger, more naive self from what was coming, I also recognize that this experience, as traumatic as it was, taught me things about human nature, about resilience, about my own strength that I might never have learned otherwise. I discovered that I'm tougher than I thought I was, that I can face devastating betrayal and come out the other side still standing, still capable of joy and trust and meaningful relationships, still willing to engage with the world rather than withdrawing into isolated bitterness and paranoia. That doesn't mean I'm grateful for what happened. I'm absolutely not, and I wouldn't wish this experience on my worst enemy. But I can acknowledge that I grew from it, that I became more discerning, more aware, more appreciative of genuine relationships, more careful about protecting myself while not becoming so closed off that I can't connect with others. The people who tried to destroy me didn't succeed in their ultimate goal. They wanted me broken, destitute, dependent on them so they could further exploit and control me. Instead, I'm independent, secure, and completely free from their toxic influence forever. So now I want to hear from you, because your voice matters, and your experiences and insights can help others who might be going through similar situations right now. Have you ever felt like something was off in your relationships but couldn't quite put your finger on what it was? Have you ignored your instincts to keep the peace or maintain relationships, only to discover later that your gut feeling was absolutely right and you should have listened to it sooner? Drop a comment below and share your story, because when we share these difficult experiences with each other, we help each other recognize the warning signs earlier and protect ourselves from predators who wear friendly, familiar faces. This isn't just about my story anymore. It's about all of us learning together to be more vigilant, more questioning, more willing to protect ourselves even when it means having uncomfortable conversations or suspecting people we care about. Understanding the tactics that financial predators use, especially when those predators are people close to us rather than strangers, is absolutely crucial in today's world, where our entire lives are interconnected through digital systems that can be hacked or manipulated by anyone with the right information and access. The reality that nobody wants to talk about is that identity theft and financial fraud by family members and close associates is far more common than anyone wants to admit. And it often goes unreported because victims feel ashamed or embarrassed, or they want to protect the perpetrators from consequences out of misplaced loyalty. But that silence only enables more abuse and allows these predators to continue victimizing others. If this story resonated with you, if it touched your heart, or made you think differently about your own relationships and financial security, if it gave you that uncomfortable feeling that maybe you need to pay closer attention to your own situation, please leave a like on this video right now. Your engagement tells me that these kinds of honest, raw stories matter to you, that sharing difficult truths about betrayal and survival and justice is valuable and helpful. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more tales of truth revealed and justice served, more narratives about real people facing real challenges and coming out stronger on the other side, please subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales right now. Hit that subscribe button and make absolutely sure you turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you never miss a new story when we post it. I share these experiences, these painful but ultimately empowering stories, not to depress you or make you paranoid about everyone in your life, but to educate, to warn, to empower you to protect yourself and recognize danger before it's too late to do anything about it. Every single week, we bring you true stories of betrayal, survival, justice, and redemption. Stories that remind us of our shared humanity and our incredible capacity to overcome even the worst circumstances life throws at us. This channel is built on authentic experiences and real emotions, on the kind of raw honesty that helps all of us navigate this complicated, sometimes treacherous world a little bit better and a little bit safer. So please become part of this growing community by subscribing today, and let's continue these important conversations together in the comments section of every video we post. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening to my story with an open heart and mind, and remember, always trust your instincts. Never be afraid to ask questions even when they seem awkward. Protect yourself and your assets vigilantly. And never be afraid to challenge people when something doesn't feel right, even if those people are the ones closest to you in life. Your financial security and your peace of mind are worth infinitely more than maintaining false relationships with people who don't actually have your best interests at heart and who are willing to destroy you for their own gain. Stay safe out there. Stay vigilant and aware. Protect yourself and the people you truly love. And I'll see you in the next story right here at My Truth Revealed Tales.